Welcome back, and the time has finally come for us to talk about handling misbehaviors. So under the umbrella of classroom management, we've looked at things like classroom climate and procedures and rules, but now is going to be when we try to focus on having a productive classroom by having students who are well behaved. Now, I'd like to point out that we have already covered a little bit of this if you think back to operant conditioning, and we talked about rewards and punishments. Rewards and punishments is one way of handling misbehaviors. We call this the discipline approach. So the discipline approach to handling misbehaviors is what we call reactive. So what that means is you wait until the misbehavior occurs and then you react to it by applying a consequence, right? Misbehavior, consequence. It's problem driven. So the problem occurs and you solve it with your consequence. One of the problems with this discipline approach is it only promotes temporary compliance. So it might work that day, but maybe not future days. It might work in your class, but perhaps not in other classes. So it's not necessarily the best approach, although it is quite common. Again, misbehavior occurs, apply a consequence. We're going to focus today on the classroom management approach. And with this approach, sorry, I have a cat that's actually biting me. With the classroom management approach, it is what we call proactive. So rather than waiting for the misbehavior to occur, you go ahead and think about ways to handle things ahead of time. It's productivity driven. So it's based on the idea that you're focusing on how do I have a productive class with time on task and where students are busily engaged in learning. And it promotes responsibility in your students because it is something that is more than temporary. It helps them to be more responsible for their own behaviors, therefore more effective. So I like this quote, discipline in the 21st century should be proactive, focused on preventing conflicts and disruptions rather than just punishing misbehaviors. The goal of discipline should be self-control. The teacher's job is not to control, but to teach. Not to command, but to influence. And I thought that was a nice way of viewing classroom management. And one more quote. This one I like perhaps even more. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I'm sure you've heard that famous Benjamin Franklin quote, but it's going to really help us as we start down our path with classroom management. So we're going to start by looking at prevention. The idea that before misbehavior even occurs, what can you do as a teacher to try to prevent misbehaviors? So speaking of preventing misbehaviors, this little cat here, while I'm doing my video, is currently biting my papers and biting my shirt trying to get my attention. So I'm going to be preventative and I'm going to put her outside and I'll be right back so we can focus without misbehaviors. Sorry. So we are now cat free. Where was I? Preventing misbehaviors. Let's begin. We're going to look at a variety of things that you can do as a teacher to try to set up a classroom where students are less likely to misbehave. First and foremost, you have to teach them about your rules, procedures, and consequences. Well, we've already covered this. So you know what procedures and rules are. You know the idea about how to teach them. But this is just to reinforce that idea that by doing this, you will set up a classroom where misbehaviors are less likely to occur because they know what they should and shouldn't do. They know what the consequences are. They're informed. And also posting them, I think, is helpful for that too, so they can see them and be constantly reminded of them. All right, something else simple you can do is think about room arrangement. When you plan your room, you want to think about where your students are going to sit, how close do you want them to be one another, do you want to have assigned seating, and how do you plan on doing that? You want to think about minimizing distractions, right? So you also want to have a fluid seating chart that you control, and you want your misbehaving students to sit near you. Because if your misbehaving students are back in the back corner, it's going to be harder for you to correct them. So you do want those students to be close to you, and also your mere presence will help them behave a bit. Now, I did have to include this. It says, dear teacher, I talk to everyone. Moving my seat will not help. Yes, you will have those students. And those students that perhaps even by sitting close to you, then they're going to want to interact with you. But still, the idea of being in control of your seating chart and minimizing distractions is still preventative and helpful. So speaking of the idea of your mere presence helping students behave, our next item on the list for preventing misbehaviors is proximity control. And this is the idea that you want to move around the classroom while you're teaching so that you can be near your students, right? So your presence near them will help them to behave. So you need to be able to go around your classroom and be present. And if you have students that are misbehaving, or if they're doing other work, or if they're talking to one another, you need to be able to go over and stand near them while you're teaching. So you want to think about how your room is set up to make sure that you're able to do that. You can see that although this room here looks nice, it's quite cramped, and it would be very hard to get around to use proximity control. Something else you can use is signals and cues and reminders. So before misbehavior gets out of hand, or prior to it, when you're in a situation you think misbehavior could occur because maybe they're getting ready to do group work or they're in a transition, give these students a signal, a cue, or a reminder on how they should behave. So again, rather than having it get out of control and have to give a consequence, remind them, gentle reminders. So before you get into group work, talk with them about, okay, here's the noise level I'm hoping for. I want you to be quiet, or that whispering is what is needed. You can also talk with them ahead of time about how to identify different types of behaviors or emotions in themselves to help them learn how to self-control. Something else you want to think about, this is an interesting term, it's called with-itness. So with-itness is looking at how observant are you in the classroom and how well do you really know what's happening in your class. So being aware of what your students are doing at all times. Using your eye contact to constantly scan the class to see, is everybody on task? Is everybody listening? To look and see, do you see furrowed brows that tell you that students are confused? Do students start to be, are they dozing off? Are they bored? Okay, so using your eye contact to monitor your students. It will help you know how to teach them, but will also help you to identify misbehaviors. And if they feel like you're this guy with eyes in the back of his head, they're going to be better behaved. Reinforce the students who are behaving well. Okay, so rather than constantly being focused on punishing the bad, reinforce the good. So I had to include these memes. So I don't always copy other students, but when I do, it's to earn a reward. Students will see you rewarding other students for good behavior. They will want to act good as well. See here again, sees other student praised for raising his hand, decides to raise his hand too. So not only are you reinforcing that one student, but remember the idea of vicarious learning from social cognitive theory. Everyone in the class will learn by watching you reward those well-behaved students, and they will act accordingly if the reward is something that they desire. Now, there are all kinds of rewards you could use, whether it is simply a social reinforcer of giving them your attention, whether it is actually something tangible like the many rewards that we talked about with operant conditioning. I thought this one was kind of cute. It's called Quiet Critters. We are quiet critters. We only come around when you're working quietly. We get scared when we hear a sound. We like to sit on your desk and watch you from afar, but if you start to make some noise, we'll run back to our soundproof jar. So you can create a little story about this with your elementary students and give them quiet critters and encourage them to be quiet, to not scare the quiet critters. All right, what else can you do? This one is a little bit unusual. It's called differential reinforcement, and it is praising correct behavior that is the opposite of the misbehavior. Now, you might be thinking, what the heck is that? And how is that different from what we just talked about? All right, what we just talked about was reinforcing students who are being good, right? This is taking that misbehaving student and reinforcing that student for doing the opposite of the bad thing. Let me give you some examples. So as an example, let's say you have a student that is consistently late for class. And one day this week, they happen to come into class early or on time. Make sure you praise that behavior, because being there on time or early is incompatible with being late. They can't do both. And students will usually seek the good. They will usually act in a way that will give them a reinforcer. So again, you can't both be early and late at the same time. So in that misbehaving student, when they do the right thing, reinforce them for that. Now here's another way of doing it. Let's say you have a student that has a perpetually messy desk, but you know they're capable of cleaning it up. Maybe they need a little incentive and perhaps nothing else has worked. Have a talk with them after school and tell them that you're going to make them the desk fairy or the desk officer, however you want to phrase it, and they're in charge of desk inspections and handing out rewards. Most, especially younger students, would find that to be a big deal, and you can't both be in charge of clean desks and have a messy one yourself. So again, students will usually seek the good.
Now it's personal. The hallways are my jurisdiction. If there's a hallway infraction going on, they're going to have to deal with the dog.
All right, so what's happening there? If you've ever seen this occur where a misbehaving student gets some sort of a job that requires responsibility, like hallway monitor, or if the teacher leaves the room and has that student be in charge of keeping track of good behavior, and you're asking yourself, what the heck is going on? Well, what's going on is they've identified that perhaps this is a student who likes attention and likes the idea of authority, and perhaps if you give them those things, they might behave better. Differential reinforcement is one that in theory works, but it's one you'd certainly want to really think about and be careful with executing if you plan on using it. All right, so let's continue with preventing misbehaviors. Here's one that is much easier and much more foolproof, the idea of being a good model yourself. So over here in my cartoon it says, it's great how Mr. Watson's able to communicate with kids on their own level. Okay, you don't want to be doing this where you're misbehaving or acting like kids on their own level. So being a good model. As a teacher, if students are not supposed to have their cell phone out, you should not have your cell phone out. If they're supposed to wear goggles in science lab, you should wear goggles in science lab. You should be doing the things that you want them to do. Because basically what we've seen from social cognitive theory is students imitate their teachers. Children imitate their parents more so than they listen to us. So be a good model. Also, keep your students engaged. Remember, with intrinsic motivation, we talked about the need for arousal. Students need to be mentally stimulated. They need to be mentally productive. When they're bored, they're more likely to misbehave. So if you keep your students engaged and productive with lessons that they find interesting and meaningful, they're more likely to stay on task and be well behaved. So the better your planning is, the more interesting your lessons are, the better behaved your students are going to be. All right, so now we need to take a look at this idea of handling misbehaviors. But for the sake of keeping some of these video segments a little bit shorter, I'm going to pause here, and then on the next video we will pick up with the idea of how do you handle misbehaviors once they occur. Again, this previous section was looking at prevention. Now we're going to look at how do you deal with or react to misbehaviors, and again, it will be coming up in the next video. So, thanks for now.